Hey everyone, I'm here with Rex Miller. Rex is founder of Mindshift and Genius Spark, and I want to hear what that means. I know you do some executive coaching, you're a futurist, and so Rex, welcome, and tell us a little
Yeah.
bit about what you do.
Well, so a lot of what I do is work with leaders that are dealing with complex challenges, uncertainty about the future, help them navigate that. But in addition, help the teams work better
Hmm.
together. And I like to say what I do is provide adult supervision for leadership. And oftentimes, leaders that can't get along, I get paid better if they can't get along. So that's part of what I do. But my background as a futurist helps give me a framework
Yeah,
for helping anticipate what the implications of all this disruption that we've gone through in
yeah,
the past few years in return
yeah.
to office and hybrid. A lot of times what happens is we start dealing with the pain points, but we
Hmm.
really don't understand the underlying drivers.
Yeah,
So this gets into a lot of what Todd's work is about,
yeah,
adaptive leadership. How do we get to those fundamental shifts in our values and our behaviors?
yeah.
So I do that through a different kind of framework,
Hmm.
and that's a lot of what I do. Genius Spark is a tool we've developed to simplify using assessment tools, these
Hmm.
psychometric tools, to
Hmm.
help people really understand who they are at their best
Okay.
and how to play to their strengths. A
Yeah,
lot of research behind all that.
yeah,
The third element is we've got a ranch south of Fort Worth
yeah,
that is a corporate retreat facility and a place for leaders to get away
yeah,
just to recharge. So
yeah.
that's the broad brush of what I do.
That's great. That's great. I look forward to kind of probably learning some more of that as we have this conversation, and really important work. And I'm just fascinated by futurism. I'm a sci-fi geek, and so I like to think about the future.
Yeah.
But then there's a certain kind of reality in this futurism, and so let me kind of set the context for our conversation. So Todd Bolsinger actually referred you to me and said, "Hey, Rex wrote this book 20 years ago called The Millennium Matrix," and he said it's still very applicable today. Although you did send me sort of an update. There are some updates. And there's a lot of futurism in there. You kind of look at the past, you look at the present, you look at the future. And so maybe my first question would be, so the Millennium Matrix, what is it, and
Yeah.
what led you to develop it?
Well, back in college, I was trying to find kind of my sweet spot.
Hmm.
I quickly discovered my freshman year that veterinary medicine wasn't going to be my future because of organic chemistry and that kind of in calculus that killed it.
Yeah.
But I was a strong believer. In the 70s, there was this wave of revivalism going through the campuses.
Yeah.
And I was looking to how do I ground what I'm doing in my faith?
Hmm.
Um, and I discovered Professor Clifford Christians, who is
Hmm.
a strong Christian, Calvin based theology, um, and also communications expert, and looking at how different eras of communication reshaped Christianity,
Hmm.
oral culture, print, broadcast. Now, this is back in the 70s, so the digital wasn't really a thing at that time.
Yeah. Right.
And there were some frameworks to distinguish the difference, the profound difference of
Yeah.
living in an oral culture. And you could think of that as like an indigenous culture,
Hmm.
people who don't have any access to print. It's a
Yeah.
3 mile an hour world.
Yeah.
Your radius is as far as you can walk in a day. There's
Yeah.
deep intimacy. It's very communal and tribal. And then how radically that shifted when the Gutenberg printing press
Hmm.
made print the dominant way we understand the world and communicate.
Hmm.
And then in the 50s, when broadcast was becoming shaping our world,
Yeah.
now we see another new era. Well, when
Yeah.
I graduated, we were at the birth of the digital
Hmm.
revolution.
Hmm.
I worked for Southwestern Bell at the time as a
Hmm.
construction project manager.
Hmm.
But I was watching that we were moving from analog switches. Remember the rotary dials and the click,
Yeah.
click, 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 click.
Yeah.
And we had these huge, ugly buildings that still exist that had 20-foot high ceilings and 40-foot wide bays of mechanical switches that operated all the telephones.
Huh.
Well, one day, a black box probably about 12 feet long and 6 feet high showed up, and it replaced 3 floors of analog switches with a digital switch.
Wow.
So I was starting to think about, well, what are the implications of this through the lens?
Yeah.
Well, it radically changed the business model for Southwestern Bell. We went through divestiture. It changed the corporate culture.
Yeah.
It changed, my job was in change management, was taking people who had spent their whole career trying to earn a private office and now placing them in a cubicle and going through all this emotional change. And that really resonated with me.
Yeah.
But I was also seeing a change in the church taking place. We had gone through this era of the growth of celebration worship, large praise and worship, integrity communication, which is all what you'd call kind of the broadcast era of contemporary, how the music was so much different than Reformed music, so much different than Gregorian chant in oral culture. And I was starting to think about, well, what's going to happen as we move into a more distributed based? And then Eric Clapton's Unplugged album came out. And it was the best-selling album he ever had, but you see him in this acoustical environment, very intimate. And I started wondering, is there a connection and a desire and a hunger from going from this kind of mass stadium kind of experience, concert-based, not concert-based, but almost rock band-based worship, into something that's more interpersonal. And at the time, I was a board member of Lamar Boschman Ministries. So we were dealing with all these, Chris Tomlins of the world and the Redmonds of the world and all these people in our annual conferences, and just started wondering, well, how will this reshape and what will it do to the whole seeker mega church movement in time? And in the book, The Millennium Matrix, in chapter 9, I talk about the demise of the megachurch. This is in 2004, but I had formulated that in the late 90s.
Oh, wow.
Because of what the medium, again, the underlying drivers of what success looks like in a broadcast-based, celebrity-based, seeker-based kind of church. What is the fatal flaw in that? And I wrote about it in chapter 9 and even projected some of the leaders that we've seen fall recently, how it was almost inevitable of being in that trap as a leader. And so now we've moved into a new medium. We're in the kind of the early growth stage of the social mobile. And we've seen books like Jonathan Haidt's book come out on the anxious generation and so we're starting to see kind of the Achilles heel of that medium platform. And now we're moving into AI. So I've been reformulating. So what does this look like? What are the implications for leaders and organizations and society and culture as we move into that? And that's probably more detail than you want.
No,
probably got geeky, but
Well, right. So many questions, especially thinking about, okay, what's next? And you mentioned AI and lots of questions about that. Can you just say, just again, to add a little more, well, the reason I'm asking this is because I think for me anyway, it reduces my anxiety a little bit if I can think about where I am in terms of where we've been, and I can see all the development over time. So can you just say maybe just a little bit about the pros and cons, so to speak, of oral culture and print and broadcast, and just kind of like, because there's good and there is less good about
Absolutely.
each of them. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So think of them, they're tools, right?
Hmm.
And every tool does something very well, like a hammer hammers nails very well,
Yeah.
and a screwdriver does screwdriver very well. But if you try to use it for something else, you optimize a tool for what it does best.
Yeah.
But then it also becomes a little bit of a constraint,
Yeah.
a straitjacket on you, because everything gets funneled through that lens.
Hmm.
So what oral culture does extremely well is it creates intimacy and community.
Yeah. And historically, you say oral culture is from BC through 1500 ish.
Yeah, through
Yeah.
about 1500.
Yeah.
So a good representative, if you go back and you take the Catholic Church, for example,
Hmm.
it's a good reflection of what worked well in oral culture.
Yeah.
Now, of course, over time, you lose what the roots were, but you can imagine in a day when not many people could read, and you relied upon a different way of communicating. So the building was the message too. It was a replication of heaven on earth. It was the
Yeah.
temple.
Yeah.
And so when you walk in, all the feeling you have of seeing something at a scale that was magnificent in
Yeah.
size, that
Yeah.
you have no reference point. Of course, we can't relate to that because we see skyscrapers all the time.
Right.
And the stained glass windows and the icons telling the story, the building was part of the story, and it was designed in numerological sequences.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of this had symbolic significance to it.
Yeah.
The Gregorian chant was not harmony, it was a single song. Part of the magic of the Gregorian chant, or the chant itself, was it was music to tune you to the harmonic forces of the universe. So when you do do, re, mi, you can feel the part of the body that resonates when you do the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the body was almost like, the chant is like an algorithm. So there's a couple things going on simultaneously. One is the content of it, but the other part is the tuning, the up and down of the body, of tuning yourself to the cosmic forces of the universe. Well, we have no reference point for that.
Yeah.
And you look at the artwork, right? And you look at it and say, well, that doesn't look very great. My 5-year-old can do that. But what we don't realize is it's commuting two realities at one time. So the old cosmology was the sky, heaven, the earth, and beneath the earth. We see those as physical things, but they were hierarchies in importance. So when you see the Madonna and Child, and this is in the book, I show that the symbology, it's not quote literal, and that's we have a big problem in Western culture of the whole word literal. It means literate. It comes from letters, and that shapes the brain differently than passing things on through poems and repetition and elders. Elders were valued in oral culture.
Yeah.
In print culture, experts were valued.
Yeah.
And architecture changed from symbolic storytelling, and the place of the culmination of the service in an oral culture was the Eucharist, the table.
Yeah.
Well, the symbolic importance of the Reformed is the pulpit. It's the Bible. So the Bible is now the center. The priest was symbolic. The pastor is an expert in theology. And it's more of a lecture. Oral culture, it's a ceremony. It's a play. It's a divine play you're reenacting.
Yeah.
And so we don't recognize or understand these significant differences in the context of what makes it meaningful.
Yeah.
And then we move to, and then the architecture in Reform culture or print is very plain. It's
Mhm.
like a lecture hall.
Hmm.
And, a lot of the civic buildings in the United States in the early were very much patterned after that church structure.
Yeah.
And then we move into the 50s with a new form of medium.
Hmm.
So how do you optimize that?
Yeah.
Well, it's the personality that comes through.
Hmm.
And so in the reform culture, it's a lecture, right?
Yeah.
And the music is complex. It's theology to music,
Hmm.
and it's complex harmonies.
Hmm.
Well, now in the broadcast church, it's a theater.
Yeah.
It's the personality of the leader that you're looking for.
Yeah.
It's not a lecture. It's a 3-point, 5-point sermon with practical takeaways.
Yeah.
The music is less, the lyrics are easier, but the rhythms are more complex, and it's more about emotional connection rather than intellectual connection.
Yeah.
And the architecture supports that.
Yeah.
So, going through, we can see these dramatic shifts. And again, the whole principle is within that dominant medium, what works best.
Yeah. Right.
And so you saw up until like 1962, that was the peak of the Protestant churches.
Hmm.
And they've declined ever since.
Yeah.
Well, I started looking at the book, The Millennium Matrix, what's going to, at some point in time, the mega churches and the secret churches are all going to hit their peak,
Yeah.
with the boomers retiring. And we've seen how many challenges these churches have had when the founding pastor either tries to retire but comes back or falls, burns out or falls.
Yeah.
And these churches don't have the institutional framework of the Reformation churches that are doctrine based and institutional based,
Right.
or the Catholic Church that's very much more about the community of faith.
Yeah.
And then another big shift is we move from the community of faith and oral cultures, the tribe, the community, into the priesthood of the believer. And then we get even more individualized in the broadcast era. So those are some of the distinctions. And again, that's probably getting more geeky than you want to get.
No, that's great. That's great. What I love about it is that it, right, it puts us in the place, sort of. I don't mean this negatively, but as an observer, we're observing what's happening, which gives us. It's getting on the balcony, to use Ronald Heifetz's language, right? We're getting on the balcony to see how culture is influencing the way we worship, the way we do ministry on the dance floor, again, to use the Heifetz's language. And so, okay, so now would you say we are in the digital age, the digital culture at this point?
Yeah, we're moving beyond the digital culture into the social mobile.
Okay.
And then we're just starting to get into the AI world.
Yeah. And so then how does digital differ from, what are the distinctives of digital and social mobile? And then maybe we don't know yet about AI.
Well, we do know some things about
Okay.
AI.
Okay.
But so when we look at, for example, digital, the communication structure is interactive and it's networked, right?
Yeah.
But now social mobile, but you still have to have a computer, and you still have to have the resources. But now with social mobile, look at what's happening to the third world countries and how ubiquitous it is. And it's more real time.
Yeah.
And it's more personalized. So that's one distinction with social mobile. As we move into AI, it'll become more predictive, and individuals will become more autonomous. They'll become their own kind of wisdom and their own source of knowledge. From a community standpoint, we go from being in digital network and participation, think like Wikipedia.
Okay.
Now we're going to have these very hyper-connected micro communities. And we already see that now in kind of these, just the way we're polarized in our politics.
Right.
These micro communities that are hyper-connected and things can go viral very quickly.
Yeah.
One of the examples of that was the Arab Spring, how viral that became. But we see it in our politics too.
Yeah.
Well, now we'll move in from AI. We'll go from hyper-connected micro-communities into hyper-personalized AI-mediated communities. In other words, AI will connect you with people, and it'll be very tailored to your specific needs, because that's what AI does. It learns your preferences.
Right.
And we already see that in the way ads are pointed towards us and lifestyle things. It's you search something on a website and all of a sudden you're on Facebook and an ad comes up for that and you go, what's going on? How do they know this?
Right.
The authority structure, oral culture was elders and storytellers.
Mm-hmm.
In print, it's authors, experts, and institutions.
Mm-hmm.
In broadcast, it's the producers and the broadcasters and the personalities as authority.
Yeah.
In digital, it becomes decentralized, and it becomes the user communities that create, like Wikipedia again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In social mobile, we're going to platforms and influencers as our authorities. And then AI will be algorithms that become the new authority for us and the new drivers. So those are some of the ways. And I could go through a couple others, like, where knowledge comes from, or how we'll become engaged, or cultural impact. But that gives you a little bit of a view of where these things are headed.
It stresses me out a little bit.
Well, but yes, it could.
Yeah.
But when I was asked to write the Millennium Matrix in the early 2000s because I had presented this framework to some of the early emerging church conferences.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Leadership Network said, we haven't seen a structure like this. And it removes, I don't know if you remember those days with the Brian McLarens and the Doug Padgetts and those guys, but it was really, the moderns and the postmoderns and the good guys and the bad guys and all of that. This took away that framework of pitting us against each other to really understand what's happening. Our brains are literally being rewired by these mediums.
Yeah.
And so we need to understand that a new rewiring creates new perceptions. New perceptions create different forms of relationships, and different forms of relationships then lead to different ways of organizing those relationships. And ultimately, then there's institutions that channel this new capacity.
Yeah. Excuse me. Forgot to have my cup of water here with me. Yeah, I love that the Millennium Matrix kind of took away the good guy, bad guy. We're here to do it better than you used to do it. I remember in those days, mid to late 90s, early 2000s, people talking a lot about going back to the early church, doing church the way they did in the early church.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And really it was just living into sort of the new culture that we were moving into, the MTV Unplugged kind of culture. At least that's kind of what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, and a lot of it was candles and reflection and a little bit of sprinkling some liturgy into this to kind of recapture paradise lost, so to speak. But that's a natural instinct to go back and kind of have this sentimental recapture of things that we used to have.
Yeah. Okay. So then looking now to where we are and where we're going, Church Leadership Institute here, we talk a lot about adaptive leadership and leading through disruptive change, challenging
Yep.
change, and having even to initiate change in some ways, in a lot of ways, just as we adapt to what's happening around us. And so, let's see, what's the next question? Well, okay, I mentioned a few minutes ago that it stresses me out, and so, right, what happens to us pastors? I grew up, I would say, in the broadcast age, right? That was kind
Right.
of
So
what
did I. Yeah.
yeah.
Right.
And so moving into digital is harder for me than it is for my kids. That's the age they're growing up in. But what does that mean for us, for how we do church, and then looking at AI and social, what does he call it? Social, mobile, and AI. Like, what does that mean for how we do church?
Yeah, it's a great
Yeah.
question. Well, first of all, the gatekeepers, it's the collapse of the gatekeepers, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then there's this mass amateurization, the whole influencer thing, the
Mm-hmm.
whole Joe Rogan phenomenon. He's got 11 million viewers.
Yeah.
CNN on a good night has about 900,000 viewers.
Wow. Wow.
We can coordinate collective action so much easier. The cost of bringing people together to coordinate around a mission or anything is so much easier to handle.
Mm-hmm.
We're losing institutional trust. In the 1960s, 75% of the Americans believed that the institutions were good. Now it's 22%. So we're seeing all of these shifts. Now, what we can do with it that we couldn't before, I don't need a doctorate in theology because all the best content is already there.
Yeah.
So curating the content,
Yeah.
coming together is so much easier because I can just post, we're going to have something at our barn, Friday night, and here's the topic, and we're going to watch this thing, and we're going to facilitate a collective conversation. We're going to break bread together.
Yeah.
I could probably have 30, 40 people show up easily for that.
Yeah.
What Francis Chan has done with his church is interesting. We've got, for example, the YouVersion Bible.
Yeah.
And there are we can synchronize across a group on this is where we're at. And when we come together, here's our discussion questions.
Yeah.
And we're going to meet in homes and break bread. So this decentralization, and we've talked about, you've grown up too, where preachers have said, we're not keepers of the aquarium. And that's the challenge of large kind of event-driven ministries is that they become captive to creating what I call this ghetto of salt and light. But now we have the opportunity to be more distributive, and our charity can be more firsthand charity instead of mediated through a large organization where we give money, and our soul is no longer attached to the charity we do because we're doing it firsthand.
Right.
So there's all kinds of potential.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we have to look at kind of the bargain we make when we take on a new media and restructure around that media, because it's also got its shadow side and its dark side. Every tool, has that, whether it's nuclear power or medical breakthrough or anything. It all has the great upside, but it's also got the shadow side too.
Yeah. So as we move forward and move into new cultures and have to sort of relearn how to be the church in a world where, how we once did things doesn't resonate with newer generations, people who are growing up in different kinds of cultures. So the experience of loss for those of us who are getting older, maybe I should say older, those of us who are older, can be significant, right? And so maybe reflect a little bit on how an understanding of the Millennium Matrix, I think is a really good tool, can help us sort of navigate that experience of loss as we move and adapt. Yeah.
Well, so I am a broadcast native. That's my first language. Print's my second language. And then, of course, the digital era. And so learning more from the rhythms and the cues. And I think this kind of principle holds true. When I was, what fueled the megachurch, one of the stories is Bill Hybels at Sun City in, I think it was Park Ridge, Illinois, where it was the youth that was kind of on fire for God. And because they weren't tithing and they didn't have income, that church encouraged him to do something different. Mm-hmm. And so they found this movie theater in Rolling Meadows, Illinois, called Willow Creek. Yeah. And they created this completely different kind of experience. Now, what's going to happen is there are going to be people who want to stay in the old. They're not going to want to go into the new promised land. They're going to want to stay where they're at. Yeah. But some will go, and they'll provide some wisdom and some guidance and some guide rails along the way. But, creative disruption is the way of the world. Yeah. And, you adapt or die. It's Shinseki's quote, General Shinseki, if you don't like change, you'll like irrelevance even less. Yeah. And, I'm not one of those that is very, it's the reality is the reality. It's changing, and either you adapt to it or you don't. Yeah. Now, as a leader trying to bring people through that's a different, I don't have that burden to have to take people through that. So I can be more of the prophet into the situation of here's the future, here's the stakes, here's where you're stuck. Yeah. And then I can exit, and the leader's got to help take them through that journey.
Well, do you, as you've looked at sort of the transitions from the various cultures of the past, have you seen ways that some have made that transition effectively that we can learn from?
Yeah, and more so in the corporate world than in church. Church is its own unique, boat anchor experience. But for example, you're a fiction reader. So William Gibson, who wrote Necromancer, and has my favorite quote: "The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed." Oh. So there's some telltale signs that it's time to go on a hero's journey. Mm-hmm. One telltale sign is we're plateauing in our membership, or our members are getting older, or our giving is plateauing. Now it's time to not try to rearrange the chairs in the Titanic. Try to upskill, get more up-tempoed worship, and, get a young person with a perm in their hair that plays guitar and can worship for you. Yeah. Those are all what would be called those technical or tactical changes. Right. What you do is you go and see who is doing it differently, who's defying the norm and getting better results. Those are called bright spots. So you go look at what are they doing differently. Yeah. The movie Jesus Revolution is a great story in, a pastor kind of stuck, Chuck Smith kind of stuck in the past, and his kids are, saying, hey, there's other things going out there. And he went to see, and what he saw was the fervency and the energy. And he said, I need to get on board with this wave. Yeah. God has a wave going on, and we need to go away from our certainty. And, Todd talks about under pressure that you either crack down or cave in. Yeah. That's, I can't remember his specific way of saying that. Yeah. But, you either failure of heart or failure of nerve, I think it is. Yeah. But going from certainty to curiosity, that's the posture we have to have.
Yeah.
We've got a church locally here that does not believe in having guitars and things, and they still wear suits. And their average age is 67 years old in that congregation. That's the average age. So there will be churches that will hold on praying for the rapture, which they need to rethink their theology on that message altogether.
Yeah.
But there will be those who say, you know what, we're stuck. Let's go explore. And sometimes it can be a conference that you hear something. It can find, this little kind of out of the way church. For me, it was going to a barn in the 1970s and seeing people do things completely different coming out of a fundamental dispensational group. And I said, whoa, but I love the energy here. And I love the heart of the people.
Yeah.
And change is always messy too.
Yeah. I love the phrase you said, from certainty to curiosity. I think that's a key to navigating the change, right? To go from saying, we know that this is the right and only way to do things, to saying, I wonder what's happening here. And going in somewhat open-handedly. I like to think, I love the expression tight-fistedness versus open-handedness, which comes from, the Exodus, but it's not just about, what we do with our money. It's about how our posture towards the world. And so if we come to these changes in the world tight-fistedly, we're not going to learn anything. We're not going to be able to give or receive anything. But if we can come open-handedly and say, I wonder what's happening here. I love that.
Recommend people watch the movie Pleasantville.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's a scene of a town where everything is perfect and it's all black and white.
Yeah.
And a young kid experiences color TV, gets drawn in, and then it begins to change the whole world. But the leaders and the community leaders are hunkered down as the whole world around them is changing in a bowling alley.
Yeah.
And they say, we're safe here because nothing will change in this bowling alley.
Interesting.
And that's a prophetic message to the church. You can hunker down and circle the wagons, but your extinction is kind of, you've just determined your end.
Right. This is really good. I really appreciate this framework, and this, as a tool, but also just as a mindset or a way of a worldview, in a sense, seeing the world in terms of these different kinds of cultures, and the and the fact that it gives us the ability then just to put ourselves, or to see ourselves in terms of our context more clearly, I think. I have one last question that doesn't have to do, but maybe it does, about adaptive leadership, but it's a curiosity one, and maybe one that people are interested in. In regard to, you mentioned Bill Hybels, and he kind of had a bit of a fall near the end, and there's sort of these revelations of abuse of power, spiritual abuse. Is that a product that that's
baked
uncovering?
Into the system?
Yeah, can you say just something about that?
Well, so what works best in that broadcast celebrity pastor role is you need a personality that's engaging, can bring people. Then you need to present a gospel that looks better than reality, bigger and better than life. You have worship that's bigger and better than, it's kind of like the message is, don't try this at home. Let the professionals do this. And then that pastor now has to create a persona, and that persona has to be marketed. So it has to be consistent, on brand. And then that pastor eventually has to live up to that, which is a bar that they can never do. So at some point in time, the stakes are going to get high. The progress, where they get more isolated and more insulated, and either believe the image that they've created, which is a false image, or they will burn out trying to keep up with it. But ultimately, it's going to blow up. And I think, gosh, just this last year alone, one of the churches that we attended for a long time, the senior pastor, the scandals of all the different churches, the large mega churches.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. I was looking at the common denominator because there are other pastors of mega churches that have been fined, like Rick Warren and Ken Ulmer. And the difference is they were never on television. They never had a television ministry.
Oh, interesting.
So that I don't know if that's a correlation. It's not a causation, but there's something about projecting an image on this big screen.
Yeah.
And all the pomp and circumstance you have to do to attract people and to compete with all the other people that are doing it.
Yeah.
It's just kind of built into the mechanism.
And then is the transition to digital and social mobile also playing into sort of the uncovering of
totally
the dysfunction?
Right.
Yeah.
You couldn't have uncovered this stuff unless somebody tweeted or Facebooked or said something that said, "What? That happened?"
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, that happened to me too. Oh, this happened to me.
Right.
And then boom, it's almost a predictable viral death spiral that takes place.
So one of the upsides to the social mobile is perhaps the call to integrity and, living what you say you're living. And because what's the verse anyway? Everything comes out.
Well, everything comes out, but we still have that challenge, even with social media, of only putting the images of your happiness on a Caribbean cruise or whatever.
Yeah, that's true.
So I guess one of the single messages or one of the threads is, as I'm thinking through, all of these things are tools. Yeah. But when they become your master, and that's the story behind Frankenstein. We create this thing, and then the thing we created to use to serve, we end up serving it.
Yes.
And we're trapped. And part of the trap of the broadcast church is their budgets.
Yeah.
They've got to feed that monster every week, and it's got to be better than last week.
Yeah.
So we need to know going in when the shift between this thing being a tool to enhance, make us more effective, more connected, more human, then becomes the thing we serve.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. That's good. There's so much more to talk about and to learn here. And so, first of all, thank you for this really good, eye-opening conversation. And I would refer people to your book, The Millennium Matrix. You sent me an update.
2004, yeah.
So, is there if they wanted to learn more about you and the work you're currently doing,
just go to rexmiller.com or look me up on LinkedIn. And I post regularly on LinkedIn. And the interview I've already started reworking Millennium Matrix to update it. So I'll probably have some posts on it. Yeah. And it may become a book by the end of the year. Or not the end of this year, but the end of 2025.
Okay, good. Well, maybe we'll do a follow-up and kind of...
absolutely.
Because there's definitely, even now, I'm like, gosh, there's so much more I want to... We've already gone longer than I usually do on this podcast.
I told you the questions you asked will take us down a deep...
Yeah, I didn't even ask all of them.
Right.
So anyway, hey, thank you so much. This
Marcus,
was fantastic.
You're welcome.
Great to be with you.